So random encounters for me kind of addresses these very specific issues, which is sort of like players stalling in a session, over resting that sort of 15-minute workday, when they're getting sort of ahead of the prep, or they're kind of getting off, not necessarily off the rails in a railroading sense, but I have prepped, A, B, and C, and they have made a hard right turn, and they are heading afield. They are exiting the the quest zone, if we want to. I mean, I could be trying to nudge them back towards if they think they're following the thread, and I'm trying to nudge them back towards. But otherwise, I'm just sort of trying to lay out more tracks in front of them as they're going in this certain direction until I can get back to prep and sort of figure out where they want to go and what they want to do. And then I can prep that specific sort of information for them. So that's for me, that is where random encounters kind of step in. That's sort of been the good solution for me. The thing that random encounters, when you hear it for a lot of DMs and players, it leaves a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. And I think that that's because D&D specifically has not done a very good job of sort of explaining why they're there, what they're for. We know what they are, but we don't know they don't do a very good job of explaining why you actually want to include them in your games. And for me, that was sort of the like light switch flip moment. I was like, oh, once I figured it out, and I was like, why didn't in all the editions of D&D I've played and all the other games I've played, nobody really explained why I would want to use them and why I should be using them in my game. What exactly is a random encounter or a wandering monster encounter, whatever you want to call it? For me, it's a good way to put danger back into the game by making sure that anytime the party leaves a safe haven they're in, so basically any sort of settlement or anything like that, they are in fact entering the Kenny Loggins trademark danger zone. We're talking about providing new and unexpected dangers and challenges for you and your players to keep things interesting for both sides, because you don't know necessarily when the encounter is going to come up or what it's going to look like. So it's a nice thing as a DM to also be surprised by what's going on in the game and being kind of thrilled with what's going on. So obviously random encounters have picked up sort of a bad reputation over the years, and that's not surprising. We can actually trace that all the way back to sort of the old ways, the like Gygax ways. I've been watching Gen Con did a series this year. Their YouTube videos, you can go check them out. I highly recommend you do. But you gotta have about 30 hours to burn. And that makes it seem like there's a lot of videos. I think there are 5. They're just all about 6 hours long. So keep that in mind. But they've been really interesting. So Gen Con did this video series to celebrate the 50th anniversary of D&D, where they played 5 different games of 5 different editions of D&D. And they talk about sort of the history and the design about it. And starting with 2nd edition, they had the lead designer from every edition of the game there to run the game. And also to give their insights about, like, this is what was going on in the company at the time. This is sort of our design directives. This is why we made certain choices. This is why we made other choices. So it's been really interesting to watch. It's really good. So if you're interested in sort of like the history of D&D and role-playing games in general, I highly recommend going checking it out. It's all on YouTube. It's all free. It's all super fun. But in that, they noted that it's something that sort of like the old grognards, those old school people kind of know implicitly. But prior to 3rd edition, you was simply could not learn how to play the game by buying and reading the books. Like, that's kind of a weird function of D&D, TSR D&D. You needed to know someone who already knew how to play and could interpret the books, because the books were more like tech manuals for somebody who already knew what they were doing. And so there were a number of people, and they talk about that, people, especially kids, but even adults, who would buy the books or would get the books as a gift or whatever it was, and read them and be like, this is really cool. I have no idea how to play this game. And you hear all the stories of people who are like, yeah, we just played the rules completely wrong. We just kind of made it up as we went, and we had a great time. That make-believe aspect, that wonder of childness, that inner child that kind of just allows you to have fun, which is really cool. That dovetails specifically into random encounters because they just don't explain why. The why of random encounters. From the very beginning all the way up to today in 5th edition. But if you bust out the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide and look under random encounters, at no point does it really tell you why you should run random encounters. It tells you what they are and how to build a table, provides tables for you for different biomes and things like that, but it doesn't tell you why. And that's just this weird persistence of D&D with random encounters. It just does this terribly poor job of telling you why you should use it. It'll tell you what they are, where they can be, but they don't tell you when you should be using them. Actually, I don't even think 5th edition tells you any role mechanics for it, and it doesn't tell you why you should use them or how to use them effectively, which was like the more salient questions to really answer with them. And I think that's why most people have this sour taste with random encounters, because they're often kind of just that. They're just random. They're not thoughtfully implemented. I find the term wandering monsters is more appropriate, which is the old term, which I think is a little bit more thoughtful about, descriptive about how it's supposed to be used. It's a little bit more appropriate. It's about coming across other creatures, not about tossing an unnecessary combat encounter, an unnecessary fight in an average game session. As we know, is often the majority of time spent is planned combat encounters in any sort of game, because combat is so bloated in modern D&D that it feels weird. You're just going to throw an extra fight in there that wastes more time, that doesn't progress the story, etc. Just because lol random. Like, you understand why people are like that, and I was certainly of that mind for a long time, and it wasn't really until just a few years ago that I sort of changed my mind on that. Why did I start using random encounters? Well, at first it kind of came with an understanding of how random encounters could be useful for my games. For me, it's about increasing the level of tension and pushing players towards decision and action. Wandering monsters was an inclusion in early D&D, where combats were woefully dangerous, and defeating monsters did not grant you XP. So it's important to remember that is where the wandering monsters or random encounters comes from. It comes from an edition of the game where you do not get anything out of fighting monsters, except for maybe their loot, if they have loot on them. But the act of fighting monsters and killing creatures does not give you any experience. It doesn't give you any level of advancement. It doesn't do anything. All that's tied to gold. It's why the old style of play feels so very different, because the motivation is very different. The old school motivation is, well, you accumulate wealth, because if you accumulate wealth, you can accumulate levels. You can advance. Whereas modern D&D, almost the only thing that gives you XP explicitly in the game is monsters. Obviously, why we spend a lot of time fighting monsters. And those monsters themselves don't actually come with loot tables. But in old school D&D, they come with loot tables to kind of tell you like what these monsters might have on them. So you see the difference. Old editions of D&D, that sort of OSR clone stuff, it's about sneaking and stealing and tricking and ambushing monsters whenever possible. That's like the primary modes of play. And that's very different than sort of like contemporary D&D, where it's about sort of like squaring up with monsters in even combat sport, Avengers, Civil War style. Two forces run against each other. If you were trying to do that in old school D&D, that's just a great way to like lose your character very quickly, because your characters are very frail, and like one save, one bad die roll, or one good but die roll on the bad guy's side is the difference between having a living character and having a dead character and having to roll up another one. It's very different from today's primary mode of play, which I feel is very much that sort of fantasy superheroes kind of feeling. For me, it was about the why for it was stopping characters from doing the things that kind of broke the idea that the world was dangerous, that they were in a dangerous situation. So that was things like resting in dungeons, spending a bunch of time in dungeons searching rooms for treasure, checking every single nook and cranny of every single dungeon. Like, all that stuff used to be really risky because the DM was rolling actively every round that you guys were moving through the dungeon to see if wandering monsters were going to stumble across the party. But when we took out that sort of wandering monster stuff in contemporary D&D, you see a different mode of play where the parties now will spend a lot of time scouring every inch of every dungeon to avoid every single trap and to find every single piece of treasure that they can find. So the mindset in that old time was that the dungeon is capital D dangerous. It's always dangerous. The wilderness is always dangerous. You're trying to quietly and quickly and as safely as possible sort of fill your pockets with treasure and book it back to the nearest township, because if you can get that wealth back to a safe haven, then it counts as XP for you. and you can level up. That's a very different way of playing and addressing the core idea of the game of going out and doing adventuring. It's very, very different than sort of contemporary D&D. We can take that old stuff, we can take the best of that and sort of like migrate some of that feeling into our modern games where it's kind of lacking, and where we have trouble doing things like challenging player characters, try to take a little bit of that power back from like the super powered fantasy superheroes and pull that back to sort of our DM side and give us a little bit more control in the danger levels of the game and kind of what's going on with it. For my games, and this is sort of how I implement it, settlements are safe, generally. Now, it doesn't mean you can't get into fights. If you've watched a solo RPG, you know that we get in a lot of trouble in cities as well. Like, there's plenty of ways to get in trouble. But the settlements themselves are generally safer. Traveling along roads is generally safer than going off-road. Sure, yeah, you're going to come across some street gangs, the highwaymen, goblins, and all that sort of normal humanoid sort of travel threats. But getting off-road into the wilderness where the monsters have their terrible dungeons and they lurk in the darkness, that's always going to be dangerous. So anytime that you're moving through that, it's always going to be dangerous. That's also where the wealth and the story threads should lead us. It should lead our player characters and our players in to want to go into that danger, to leave behind the safe haven and go into danger, because that's where the adventure is, right? That's where cool story is, that's where all the cool loot is, that's where all the monsters are that give us the XP. All that stuff's not in the city for the most part, not in these sort of safe villages and cities and townships. They're not there. We have to go afield. We have to go into the darkness. So random encounters can help players make decisions. Start looking at, when do I decide to use a random encounter? I'm looking to try to push the players to make a decision, or to just do something when they're stalling out or they're sitting around wasting precious session time. If you're limiting how the PCs always kick the snot out of your bad guys, random encounters solve that too, for the most part. Multiple combats tend to whittle down PC resources. For me, coming to this realization was like a complete 180 on it. It was like, now my monsters spend most of the time kicking the snot out of PCs and chasing them around dungeons and across the wilderness. Because every time that they go into that, they are on the monster's turf. They have that home field advantage, and the bush is just flush with them. Always run across them, and they are gonna be a bad time. And I mix this in, of course, with the sort of morale system. That idea that I'm gonna have a lot of combats. They're gonna be quick. They're gonna be like hit and run most of the time. People are going to show up, they're going to attack you, you guys are going to swap some hit points, you're going to swap some paint, and then the bad guys are going to run away. They're not here to die. They came across you, they thought maybe you were going to be a soft target, maybe they want your stuff. They attack you, you put up a stern resistance, they're like, alright, well that's probably too much effort for us, so we're gonna leave and go do something else. We're gonna find easier prey. That's one way to just make the world, once you get sort of off the roads, out of the settlements, always feel like it's dangerous. Like, there's always going to be some sort of wandering monster around the next bend, through the next thicket, through the next hedgerow. They're there, and you're going to stumble across them, and they're going to stumble across you. So just traveling is dangerous. Trying to rest is dangerous. Trying to do basically anything when you're outside of town is generally dangerous, especially if you're going to go off-road. So that's sort of the feeling that I'm trying to evoke with my games, and how my games start to feel, I think, very different from a lot of other Dungeon Masters. You know, I've played with and been a player for the games and seen how they run, and the things that I see are different, and the things that, when I feel like I'm in that superhero, fantasy superhero kind of mode, I'm like, instead of hinging on like 1, 2, or 3 big set piece battles, to instead just have a whole bunch of small battles that kind of whittle away resources and then hit them with the big battle. When I've got, you know, they spent half their spell slots and fighters already used their second wind and action surge for the day. They're going into it not at 100%, they're going into it at like 50%. But my monsters, my big set piece battle, those guys are coming in fresh and ready to fight. They're all at 100%. That changes the scales. That makes, so now the set piece battles feel dangerous because they are more dangerous, because not necessarily because the monsters are any more dangerous, but because the PC power level went from up here where it usually is to down here, while the monsters just stayed the same. So it's just about when to put those set piece battles in and how to put obstacles in front of the players to challenge them, cut down their resources, and cut through their abilities, weather them before they get there. I think this works really well. I run milestone games anyway, so I don't use Monster XP, because I think that Monster XP is part of the problem. That is the difference. If you want to look at like one way how old D&D and new D&D are very, very different, XP and how you advance in levels is a great way to look at that. One of them's from getting wealth, and one of them's from killing or overcoming monstrous challenges. And those things look very different. There's a very different game where a person's like, I'm a thief in a town, and I'm trying to steal every coin off of every person I can find because I want that wealth to level up, versus somebody who's like, I cast Fireball on the king, how much XP is he worth when he dies? Both of those are super chaotic and maybe poisonous player elements, but you can see that those work very differently, right? They diverge quite a bit. Use morale kind of sort of keeps them short. The monsters show up, they get a few licks in, and then they retreat. The encounters themselves are not terrifying because they're not like high level. They're not those big set piece battles where we're throwing everything up against the wall. They're usually mundane. They're usually kind of like in the medium challenge difficulty rating. Sometimes even easy. If you've watched the solo RPG, you've seen how I build combats where I basically push everything up to the edge of deadly and then just kind of roll to see how many of those monsters are going to show up in the fight. So it could be all the way up to really hard, all the way down to basically trivial. Just to kind of keep it very, very random. It's the idea that those fights aren't scary because the fights are high level, but because they're ever present. These fights will keep happening. The more time you spend here, the more time you tarry here, the more time you're not moving forward in the plot, the more rolls I'm going to make, the more encounters you're going to get into. And one of the important things to sort of remember is that the moment that you're off the beaten path, you're in the monster's domain. Emphasize to the players, when you stray off the path of civilization, the monsters will not let you know peace. They're going to make it very difficult for you because this is not your place. You are a stranger in a strange place, and the night is dark and full of terrors. And those terrors are monsters, and they want to kill you and eat you and take your stuff. So when do I want to use these random encounters wandering monsters? Usually, like I say, is to unstuck players. We've all had that sort of instance as DM where when players get stuck on, they don't know where to go, or they get stuck and they kind of do a circular discussion, they kind of get into an argument, they don't know, and you don't necessarily want to sort of like lead them by the nose, but it's always nice. It kind of follows, random encounters wandering monsters for me kind of follows the old pulp writing advice, is that when you don't know what to do, have a man walk through the door with a gun. When they're stuck, when they don't know what to do, usually this is at a decision point. Usually they don't know which way to go, or they're stuck at a puzzle or something like that, and they don't know how to move forward, but there's still other avenues for them to explore. Often just telegraphing that monsters may be in the vicinity, like rolling dice and then being like, oh, you hear people moving, you hear some sort of creatures moving through the passageway, or you see their torchlight, or you have a good perception check and you see them first. That will heel turn a party really, really quickly from indecisive to like very action oriented. And that's because of the way that you set up these combats. By nature, I use milestone leveling, but even if I wasn't, random encounters don't give you XP. These encounters are technically consequences of not doing anything. So I'm not going to reward you because this is actually a consequence. So they're not going to give you any XP. They're going to give little to no treasure. It's important to remember that random encounters are sticks for your players, not carrots. The carrot is the fabulous wealth the boss is going to have. The item they're going after, defeating that big boss is going to give them a level or something, like draws the adventure to its narrative conclusion, narrative fulfillment. That's all the good stuff. That's all the carrot stuff. So these random encounters are more like the stick. This is a reminder that if you linger here, if you screw around in this dangerous area, you're going to have to pay in blood, in spells, in limited character abilities, and you're going to have, at the end of that, you're not going to have anything to show for that effort. You're just going to lose if you stick around in here. So that's, for me, that was like the game changer. I was like, oh, this is punitive. Not in a mean-spirited way, but in a way that's be like, hey, you guys can't be super casual in a dungeon or in orc tribes' territories. If they come across you, that it's going to be a fight, and you're not going to get anything out of that fight except hurt. The other thing that random encounters are really great for is to sort of like stretch that content when you need to reach things session when I talked about sort of like the players, they take a right turn, they're going tangential to whatever you prepared, or they've just done a good job of like going around prescribed encounters, stuff that you've done, and they've been clever, and you don't want to be necessarily punitive, you don't necessarily want to be like force them to like quantum ogre, be like, oh well, you have to do this combat encounter because that's what I planned. Instead I use the random encounters to be like, okay, I just need to sort of play for time. Go up there and you're just kind of chewing up time because I'm trying to get to the end of the session, because if I get to the end of the session I can prep for what you guys are doing now, but right now I don't have any prep. So I'm just trying to sort of like improvise, but not take the improvisation so far down the rabbit trail that things are just crazy and out of sorts. I can either sort of like nudge them back towards a planned path if they're off them, or help fill up the time if they've decided to follow this other tangent, and then I can just prep for the tangent at the end of the session, between sessions, for the next time. Useful when they need to be reminded of danger, when they get a little bit too casual or cavalier with kind of like what's going on, where they get a little overconfident of what of everything. Again, these are sort of the old OSR ways. These are the old ways, the Gygaxian ways. You are not going to be like Goldilocks. If you're going to try to break into somebody's house and eat their food and take a nap there and steal their stuff, they're likely going to find you. They are going to interrupt your rest. They're going to raise the alarm. They're going to call for backup. You're going to have to do a bunch of fights. Most recently, this has kind of become to, at least for people who are new to the hobby, kind of become to known as sort of like the Matt Colville screw. But really, it's just the monsters reacting to an invader in their safe haven, right? They're just reacting to a home invader who's there stealing their stuff and taking their supplies and sleeping overnight in their home. Like a weirdos, because they think they can get away with that for some reason. They can take an 8-hour break in the middle of a dungeon delve. It's wild when you kind of like extrapolate it and think about it. It's like, oh yeah, I think I'll just, like, imagine if you were going to do, let's say, a bank heist or something like that. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to break in here, we're going to open up the vault, and then we're just going to take a quick 8-hour nap, and then we'll finish the bank heist. And be like, well, no, that's probably not going to work out well. Somebody's going to find you there. There's going to be some consequences for that. It's also important to note that random monsters and wandering monsters don't have to be combats. More than just scaring them off, you can actually use them to help the players in the party if you need to. That'd be a good way to sort of like give the party a way to a neutral NPC that they can trade with, because the people they run across might be just like a neutral party. A way to sort of gain information about what's going on, you know, just have a quick conversation, do some social checks, some RP, deliver new adventure hooks, earn the party an ally. Like, there are other things you could do. They don't necessarily have to be always combat and always have to be a bad thing. Usually they are, right? Usually they're punitive, they're meant to be penalizing, but they don't always have to be. How do we do random encounters or wandering monsters? So for me, if it's in a dungeon, I do the 1d6 method. That's the straight way that it's done in the OSR. It works pretty well. There's a 1 in 6 chance that a random encounter is going to happen, but it kind of leaves them that pressure. And usually just the DM picking up the die and rolling the die is enough for the players to get on their horse. So usually don't even have to throw the encounter at them. It's just the looming threat of an encounter that it's going to do nothing but waste their resources is usually enough to get players moving. It's also useful to do like a telegraph, sort of like a warning shot, right? Versus passive perception or stealth groups, checks for groups that sort of run into each other to see, like, does somebody get surprised by somebody? Does somebody clock the other group and get an advantage over them, whether that's they want to ambush them or maybe they want to avoid the fight completely. It still kind of gives a little wibbly wobbly aspect to random encounters, so it's not always, if you have somebody in the back who is paying attention, who is alert while they're everybody else is searching the room, and you have one person who's standing guard by the door, like looking down the passage, trying to make sure you don't get ambushed. That's the person who's going to pick up wandering monsters coming by, and then they can like get everybody to be quiet and everybody can hide, and then maybe you can avoid that encounter. Usually that's enough to trigger people to be like, okay, we should probably move on. Sometimes they don't, and sometimes you're like, all right, well, I guess I'll just keep rolling for encounters then. So I usually roll a d6 if it's like in a dungeon sort of situation. If you watch the solo RPG streams that I do, you'll notice that I usually roll a d12 when I'm doing a hex crawl. On a 1 on the d12, it's the same thing. It's still a 1 in 6 chance. It's just a 1 in 6 chance of a random encounter, and then a 1 in 6 chance of basically a dressing or some sort of like non-combat encounter, which I have a number of those things sort of in my DM's binder, kind of broken up by biomes. It might be a place where they meet some other sort of like non-combat sort of encounters, where they meet some sort of other travelers, things of that nature. Let's see, pitfalls to sort of avoid with that. They just cause random encounters. That's the thing why random encounters have the bad name. So don't just be like, just cause. I know I say that right after I just talked about sort of overland travel and how I'm doing a hex crawl, but it's important to remember that random encounters are sort of like part of the play style of hex crawl. In a hex crawl, it's all about discovery. You were literally learning about the world by traveling across it. So every time that you come across a random encounter, it gives you an idea of like, hey, here are denizens that are in this area. Oh, I didn't know there were gnolls in this place. Now I know there are gnolls in this place. Okay, maybe we should prepare something like, make sure that we have something like tongues or comprehend language, so that way we can talk to them in the future if they don't speak common. Do we need to bring something? What do gnolls like? We can maybe open up some sort of barter or trade with them. If we can figure out, you know, the sort of things they're interested in getting, and we can give them those sorts of things, and they can give us some more information about what's going on in the area. Again, they don't. Those random encounters don't have to be combat encounters, especially in a hex crawl setting. That those are often, you might parlay, you might talk about things. I remember playing in a game a while ago. We were playing sort of like OSE, Old School Essentials. One of the things that was really cool is that we had an entire random encounter with a group of hobgoblins where we did like Indian leg wrestling, and we shared some wine, and they kind of told us some points of interest in the area and for us to check out, and we kind of told them some information, and it turned what could have been just like a straight normal fight in an open field into just this kind of cool RP moment where we got to know them, learned a little bit about them, got some more information about the area, about things to check out and things to avoid. If you think about random encounters in that way too, especially in the overworld sort of setting when you're just kind of traveling around in that exploration mode, they don't necessarily have to be these straightforward combat encounters. Though that is usually what's going to happen in a dungeon, because again, if we flip the script on dungeons, player characters are basically home invaders. So think of it that way. You're not going to have a casual tea and conversation with somebody who's invading your home. You're not going to invite them in for a slice of cake. You're going to be like, get the hell out of my house. It's a slightly different. That's pretty much everything I have to say about random encounters. I hope that's super useful for you guys, that it's something you should definitely try incorporate into your games in a more thoughtful way. Maybe you've used random encounters before and that just straight random. So try to be a little bit more thoughtful about that approach, especially in that sort of dungeon way, and recognize it as a way to sort of like add pressure onto the group, to kind of always kind of push them with tension and always kind of keep them moving forward. So you ratchet up the tension and the cadence of the game when they're in that sort of dangerous area, so it has that sort of feeling of danger at the table. Let me know about your experiences. If you want to support the channel, of course I have it. DriveThruRPG store with pay what you want titles if you want to do that. Coffee, that's ko-fi.com. They're linked below in the description. You can find them. Tell me about your experiences. If you have any other tips or tricks or fun stuff like this to add to your games, definitely leave them in the comments below. I want to check them out, and I'm sure other people want to have those good ideas too. But that's going to be it for me, guys. I've had a ton of fun, and I will see you guys next time. All right. Bye.